We're gonna take our time, slow down and design. Yeah.
So, starting off, we're in the Hawaiian Islands. You may have heard of them. There's Waikiki, there's surfing, hula girls, it's amazing. We are also the most isolated, inhabited archipelago in the entire world. As noticed on this Google Earth snapshot, we are that red smudge in the middle, surrounded by that big blue swath. So we're about 3,000 miles from anything. So we're pretty much in the middle of nowhere, but there are 8 main islands to our island chain, and that's broken up into 3 different counties. We have about 1.3 million inhabitants, and around 900,000 or so of those are concentrated on Oahu, which is the gathering island. And there is a nice history of permaculture in Hawaii. Some rumor has it that it was the first place Bill Mollison taught a PDC in the US, arriving on the island of Molokai. And if any of you have maybe heard of the Permaculture Designer's Manual, maybe flipped through it once or twice, there's some photos of Robin and Daniel Gorsuch on Molokai from way back when, and they're still over there doing fine work, as does happen on all of the islands. Today, though, we'll be focusing mostly on Oahu, which is where I am based. So, a little bit of information about Oahu, and to some degree Hawaii overall. We have a significant reliance upon imported food. The general statistic is that 85% of our food is imported. The rough guess, even though I don't think anyone's dared to do the hard math, is that we have about 4 days of food storage. Our port system is pretty much smack dab in the areas that are most going to be affected by sea level rise, and so we have a lot of work to be done. Our water supply is generally based on aquifers, and no one has yet to determine what is this, the quote, sustainable maximum yield in terms of how much water we can draw out. But we know that we are drawing considerable amounts out of the aquifer, which permanently reduces its ability to recharge, particularly with sea level rise as saltwater intrusion occurs. And in 2008, we had the dubious honor of being the most wasteful state in the entire country, producing in 2011 at least 7.1 pounds of trash per person per day. So there's a lot of work to be done. Excuse me. But fortunately, there's a lot of people and an entire culture that had done a lot of work there beforehand that we can key off of. So this is a very oddly shaped map, apparently, of the island of Oahu. And so those spaces that you see on there are known as moku. And these are the traditional bioregional sections that were drawn out by the ancient Hawaiians. And so essentially each island was divided into what are known as moku, and they roughly coincide with what we understand in permaculture as bioregions. So on the island of Oahu, the region of Kona shares a similar climate, in some ways at least, to regions also known as Kona on other islands. Taking it another step, we also have what are known as ahupua'a, which means ahu is an altar and pua'a is pig. And so the distinctions or the lines that were drawn between these were where trade or tax and whatnot were given as tribute on these stone altars. And so this is a pretty nice background to be working in, because the ahupua'a also roughly divide watersheds. Not every time, but in large part you would have a section of land that went from the top of the mountains all the way out into the sea and into fish ponds ringing the reef. And so it was a wonderful model of local production utilizing resources within the region. So you'd have farmers, fishers, hunters, and what have you, or other growers. The system is, to some degree, I would say, inaccurately been known as the Ohana system. So this is my bid as the Hawaiian in the room to clarify that as the ahupua'a system. That one of the keys to that was taro patches, also known as lo'i. And the taro was the potato of Hawaii. It was the staff of life. And from that, many, many varieties were grown. guess you can't quite see on there, but there's about 5 different colors of taro in that photo. These are all different varieties that I'd grown out. And so as a horticultural society, as a horticultural culture, there was a lot of in-depth knowledge of the islands that we've been fortunate to have a part in. But today, as the taro culture went the way of industrial agriculture, really in the face of annexation, thanks Andy in the UK for that, starting that one off with the colonialization bit, but we're working on it now. So essentially we went from smallholder patches being managed and then gone the way that many islands have, where we were in sugarcane production, and then we went to pineapple, and now the largest agricultural export is seed corn, genetically modified seed corn in large part. This is a photo from the island of Molokai, where the largest employer is Monsanto, and this is not an oil spill, that is erosion after a rainfall event in December about 3 years ago. And this isn't actually from an agricultural field, this is from a development, so there's a lot of work to be done. For those of you that remember the oil spill, this was about the same time, and it was quite a shocking thing to see flying over the island. So one of the things that we're working on Oahu, we're a rowdy bunch, my apologies. So we've started a Permablitz network. Myself and my co-teacher, who's somewhere back there making too much noise, Matthew Lynch, started up a Permablitz network, and we've now been running almost monthly events for the past 1.5 to 2 years or so, which has been a spectacular opportunity to connect with lots of different people, running seed share stations. The photo on the right is a design that was accomplished during one of our PDCs and then executed by those students 2 weeks ago. So this was an elementary school that had some garden beds and wanted a lot more things to happen, and we came by and the network showed up and we helped out, and they were quite happy about it. So these generally involve different workshops and events, and normally an amazing potluck. And because Permablitz, as we've experienced it, is essentially a Ponzi scheme, the way it goes is you show up, help out 3 times, and then the network comes to your place, right? So there's an exponential growth factor. We are not able to actually help everyone. The longer it persists, the more work there is to be done. So taking that model that I mentioned in terms of Moku, we've spread out our internal organization by identifying students, friends, other permaculture folks in different sections of the island and actually splitting up the management in that way. So to date, we've had 17 blitzes, almost over 3,000 hours of volunteer time, both from volunteers and then from the hui, which is the Hawaiian word for group. So our main group, our Permablitz hui, has put in a pretty good amount of time as well. But by design, what we're now doing is integrating the Permablitz Hawaii activities with our PDCs even more. So we're, as design tasks, upcoming Permablitzes are designed by our students during the design task, and then they have the opportunity to show up, help work on the initial site analysis and design during the course, working with the client, and then afterwards helping to get experience with running work days, running volunteers, and then actually executing workshops during the Permablitz event, and then get to see their design go into fruition, which works out great for us, because that means for the ones, I can just sit like that, and they do all the work, which is pretty nice for me. So another big aspect is that Oahu, being the population center, we've been looking at different ways to start incorporating urban food. And on the right is a photo of that's a big neem tree and some papayas and some other things in the back. This is in a parking lot that we made a little garden in a few years ago, and now the local businesses have taken over the management of it and are gardening for themselves and installed a nice little garden gnome. And then on the left-hand side is an entirely urban glean. So Oahu, in its own right, has a lot of production. We still have a long ways to go, but the urban spaces do have opportunity. And so we're trying to explore and expand the opportunities as they exist. One of the ways that got started was a request from the Institute for Human Services, which is a women's and children's homeless shelter in the Kaka'ako, or the Dillingham area of Honolulu, which is at about 3 p.m. in the summer, feels like the face of the sun. And they said, we were interested in growing more, we're interested in having fresh local food be part of the experience of the residents here while they stay, and also giving them a hands-on opportunity to explore gardening and to dabble with other things. So we did some design, installed some awesome gardens with a work day, and this is from standing in the street facing one direction, you see a nice verdant fence with all sorts of tasty edibles happening, and when you face the other way, that's what you see. So really trying to make the transition stark, and this has since expanded. They've now, in their men's shelter, which is down the way, have also instituted gardening, and they're now running a small farm and CSA in another part of the island, and having a full training workforce go from starting in the garden on the site to then expanding once they've gone through an initial training to working actually as farmers and getting trained up there. So it's been really nice to see that expand. So for the design, and then we had a community volunteer day, used so much chicken manure that 2 people vomited. But by the end of the day, as you know with sheet mulching, cover it up with cardboard, and it was fine. And then it turned into this. So it's a really nice opportunity to see how people can come together, and with just a little bit of interest from an organization, how they can really kind of shift the entire course of what it is to be in a homeless shelter. It now becomes an opportunity to be equipped with skills that you can take with you for the rest of your life. So we thought that was a good idea, as did some other people, and a local politician decided that we needed one of those food forest things they're doing on the mainland, since it had, as the meme grew, and so they allocated some money in the city budget. We promptly got ourselves together, made a community working group, and started mapping out to reimagine this park this is just up from the heart of downtown in Honolulu. And so we took the old AutoCAD maps from the city, reworked them, created some designs, gathered community partners, and got to work in trying to establish the baseline and the community interest to make this really happen. Came up with a management strategy, integrating the now very interested in gardening and production local homeless shelter as an adjunct to help manage the site. That was another opportunity for them. And went forward with further community engagements, working with the local community board and local businesses as well. So this is some of it. There were some issues with the site to some degree. The Parks Department had said, you can do anything, shoot for the moon, but don't touch any of the existing trees. So even though this looks fairly sparse, it's because these photos, this rendering leaves out the existing trees, which occupy almost the entire space. And so then we connected up with a local artist group that's doing murals and working with at-risk kids to get them applying their artistic creativity in ways that are more sanctioned than they might be otherwise. And it was a really nice design that came together, and because of that, the local folks working on a Complete Streets project and transit-oriented development invited us to participate in one of their Complete Street events as we set up a obviously very sparse model of what this could be like. Unfortunately, as working with bureaucracies goes, elections happened, and the support that we had in the Parks Department withered and left, and with new folks coming in, there was less institutional support. But because we had identified and cultivated these community partnerships, the project is still continuing despite the fact that the funding has gone. And as a result, actually, another nonprofit organization has come forward, is actively seeking funding and actively looking for ways to make this happen. And we're returning now back to the community partnerships and to the community itself to try and recreate a new design based off of what all of the community members are interested in. So instead of just coming sort of from the top down with the politician saying, hey, this is a great idea, I'd love to have this on my sort of check, I did this in office list. We're now returning to the community itself and trying to discern a navigable pathway so this can be repeated in different parks. So what other parks would we want to do that in? It's something that we were asking. And so I did some GIS analysis looking at areas that have above mean density, low income census tracts, and that are also have low vehicle ownership rates. So this is essentially trying to identify socioeconomic hardships and looking for ways to remedy them. So in the areas where there were overlaps, we identified all the parks in those spaces where all three of those things came together, and then further analyzed the local supermarkets and eliminated any parks that were within a half mile from there. So we're pretty much getting to the heart of food deserts on the island. As a result from that, we identified 9 potential parks of varying sizes and really in a broad diversity of communities. And so because of that identification process, we now essentially have a short list that we can go to the city who is constantly under budget and say, hey, with this community interest, we can begin to have these parks be managed in another way and sort of re-envisioned in a new way. And then further analysis of the access areas within 10 minutes by foot or by bike covers the breadth of pretty much the entire Honolulu proper area. So it's a big dream, but it's something that we're actively working towards and really happy to be a part of. So in some of the meetings, we were told that the main issues were liability and that there was something called an attractive nuisance, which I took as a compliment. Apparently they weren't talking to me, or about me at least. And so one of the issues that's come up is that in commercial and residential areas on Oahu, crop production is not an acceptable use. So now going from a policy perspective, we're looking at the zoning laws and what's been done in North American cities to see what patterns have been created for navigating the policy aspects to change those zoning laws and likely go for conditional use permits to bring agriculture back into the city. Other things that we've been up to, the sort of running gag between my teaching partner and myself is that he's the social one, I'm the ecological one, so he gets out there and does all the getting people together stuff, and that's been going quite swimmingly. So we've been having Skillshare workshops and events, and this was essentially just getting friends together, holding a space for people to share knowledge, share information, and share goods. That evolved into a now monthly event called Barter Bar, which happens at a local venue where every month there's a theme, whether it's food and restaurants or cosmetics or what have you, where people show up. It's an entirely cashless exchange, and we've managed to have some pretty novel trades. I think there was surfboards for goldfish. I brought some ducks one time. Those were pretty hot. Got a bunch of chocolate. So just creating spaces where people can have a cashless experience, share knowledge, and have a good time. My version of contribution to the barter economy is a little different, though. I run a barter butcher business. So the tagline up top, of course, being, depending on how you read it, that is animal slaughter or animals laughter. So ostensibly, if you're more into the laughter, we do some permaculture design. We can have them in their own little grazing areas, and they can live out their lives to the fullest extent that they want. So on the left there, you can see that this is something I've been doing for a few years that's evolved as different students have become aware. And so now periodic workshop that I hold unofficially titled Slaughter School. You can see a happy participant there wielding a rabbit bladder with quite a smile on his face. Also, if you ever get a chance, peacock is delicious. So, some of the other events we've been up to, there's a lot of work that's been going on in schools, focused on the Farm to School network this year, which I fortunately have the opportunity to coordinate. And in the 30, 50 odd schools, there's been a whole sort of revolution of interest in school gardening on Oahu, which has been a wonderful thing to be a part of. And so I've spent the past 3 years consulting with 15 different schools, holding workshops for them, facilitating their development, and really, really enjoying getting the opportunity to see kids get their hands in the dirt. Speaking of kids getting their hands in things, we've also been working on school waste management. So we've been making the kids get their hands in the trash. On the right-hand side there is a bunch of grudgingly sorting middle schoolers going through to assess their waste stream. And at that, we're really trying to sort of reconceptualize waste, right? Recognizing waste is food, that in natural cycles, we can have connections between all of these things. So as a result, one of the programs we've been doing is focused on siphoning off all of the food waste from school cafeterias into compost, which is then made into a beautiful resource on site and cycled into the school gardens. All right. So going forth, as a result of all the PermaBlitz interest and people wanting to know more and share more in terms of plant material, we held the first community seed and plant exchange on Oahu had about 200 people turn out. It was also on International Permaculture Day, which if you aren't familiar with, you should definitely make yourself familiar with. But it was a wonderful time. People got a chance to amble about in a beautiful setting, share seeds, swap stories, and get to hear some good music. Following that, some students of ours and other teachers, Tiamir, I know, helped out with designing and executing the first Oahu permaculture convergence that was in the fall of this year. And it was a great showing. Had a bunch of people come out. We had workshops, regional networking with people based on where they live and connecting up with what things they can do together. We had different presentations, and generally there was a lot of smiling. My partner Matt taught an ad hoc course on fertilization, and though sparsely attended, the point did get across. So it was a really great time and a wonderful opportunity, in particular because it was not something that we had to set up ourselves. So just feeling the movement really grow in the past couple of years has been something that's been really, really exciting to be a part of. All right, going forward from there, getting into some projects that we've been developing, this concept of multi-hazard food security. So this is sort of a suite of different ideas I've pieced together and have developed over a few years. So starting off from that, it really came from understanding and study and experience with tropical agroforestry. And we were working in Vanuatu a couple years back and got to experience the broad agroforestry systems that they were managing, where this is over an entire sort of mountainscape. And the slash and burn processes that they were using and the rotational aspect of it was really fascinating, but the knowledge that was held in managing a landscape that large was really impressive, and it got me thinking more about what else could be done. And so when I was musing on that some more, returned my thinking to a project I had done prior, which was focusing on designing a complete diet from tree crops. Yeah. So with that, was looking, did a project analyzing the nutrient contents of different species, and then trying to compile that into some semblance of a complete diet, really just focused on fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. From this, the caloric intake would be able to sustain 5 people on an acre over the course of a year. Those people would be very malnourished. It's about 45% fat, 45% carbohydrates, and less than 1% protein. But the idea with this is not that it's going to provide everything you need. It's that it provides a skeleton overstory, effectively, that you design around. So you're designing in diet diversity, you're designing in economic opportunity with this baseline food security. It's not everything you need, but it's a significant portion of it provided in a manner that doesn't take a whole lot of work, at least in the long run. Short term, definitely going to take some work. So building off from that, and then as I was thinking more on the sort of Vanuatu broader systems, came up with this conceptualization of another way of designing in food security using agroforestry. So essentially starting with those nutritive groups, those 3 main fats, proteins, carbohydrates, and isolating out different species which have high value to one of those or another, right? So say you've got your fats group. Within your fats group, you isolate out different groups of function groups. So we're really looking at sort of ecological function there, right? So nitrogen fixation, possibly some different spatial niches, pollinator attraction, and whatnot. So you have a function group. Within those function groups, then, you have response diversity. And that's where the multi-hazard aspect comes in, right? So we've got this group of fats. Within that group of fats, we have a group of nitrogen fixers. Within that group of nitrogen fixers, we design it, or we select species that are then tolerant to whatever hazards we're likely to face, whether that's flooding, whether that's high winds, salt, what have you, fire. And so with this, then, you have a distributed set of nutrients that are supported sort of intergroup-wise by a distributed amount of functions, and within those function groups, you even have the diversity to tolerate the various hazards that you're likely to face. This, though, would happen to take a lot of space, right? So, mind you, I was wandering around in islands in Vanuatu as I'm conceiving this. So, how would this apply to an urban context? How could you begin to translate something like that into an urban space? Essentially, how can urban communities create resilient food systems? There are various scales to this approach. Looking really at, this is that I ended up terming distributed community forestry. So taking sort of the community forestry aspects that have been going on for development for a long time, and then spreading it out over an urban landscape. And so working at different temporal and spatial scales provides many opportunities. So sort of temporally, right, we're looking at the short term. They're providing, you know, some passive production, relatively passive production. In the medium scale, it can be affording a backup food supply, and in the long-term scale, it's working towards climate change mitigation, and also, additionally, looking at integrating it with ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. So fitting in this diversity of different species within an urban landscape in a way that's aware of the various hazards that are at play, and then having those ideally also be productive things. Title pending. This is my big idea of the past couple of years, is working on developing an application that allows for streamlined site data collection that utilizes either a mobile app, a mobile device, a web app, or possibly a Google Earth plugin. And so what I found is that over time, when I would show up to do different site analysis, I was generally looking up the same data over and over. And so looking to streamline that, found different data sets, whether it was pertinent to peak sun hours or the precipitation, which is provided by a magnificent web app that was released by the University of Hawaii, which gives us rainfall by month. And so piecing that data together with soil data coming from the NRCS, and sort of branching out from an existing app, which if you aren't familiar with, you should definitely check out, called Soil Web, which is produced by the UC Davis Soil Resource Lab. And essentially, it's a push button. You show up, you push the button, it tells you your pH, your soil type, taxonomy, and a bunch of other magnificent information. And then utilizing the aspects inherent to the mobile device or to Google Earth, you're looking at analyzing your elevation, also identifying your property boundary, which can give you information about, you know, in Hawaii it's known as your tax map key. And then within the bounds of that property, using different hazard overlays, whether it's fire risk, flooding, and whatnot. So then you're identifying what hazards you're likely to face, and then having species selection based off of all of that different criteria. So from there, initially this started with a magnificent three-book set called Permaculture, written by a woman with a spectacular name, D. Hunter Beyer. It's always fun when we're on the phone. It's, hi Hunter, how are you, Hunter? And she is well. So her and another magnificent fellow, Dr. Franklin Martin, put together a three-book set, all focused on edible, useful species for the Hawaiian Islands. So the first book focuses on what are known as canoe plants and native species, so canoe plants being the plants brought over by the ancient Hawaiians. The second book focuses on various different non-endemic species, and then the third is sort of species that tend to have some degree of weediness or possible risk for that attached. So this is a wonderful resource that I regularly would flip through when going through designs and putting things together. And she was kind enough to give us access to it. Unfortunately, it's in a Word document format, so she's been self-publishing it for about 25 years, and so we're looking to help translate that into a database through using some of our previous students and some other volunteers. So that'll probably be the first iteration of the species that are pulled from, along with some others to just populate some of the hazard tolerances and different pH levels and whatnot. But going forward from there, we're looking at trying to integrate with the FAO's EcoCrop, which is a magnificent resource that allows you to enter in pretty much any species name, and it will give you far more information than you're probably ready to deal with. It operates somewhat akin to Plants for a Future, which I'm sure most of you are already familiar with, which is the magnificent compendium of about 7,000 species. The one thing that we really wanted to key in there is the ability to generate user content. And so we want this to be as an opportunity, it's a suggestion of various species, but then also not to limit species or not to try and delimit experimentation. So by incorporating user content and saying, hey, coconut didn't come up on my suggested species list, but I got one grown in the backyard and it is doing great. So we want to be able to incorporate that information in a dynamic manner. And then the broadest sort of suite that we'd like to connect with is the Agroforestry Species Switchboard, which is put together by the World Agroforestry Center, which connects to 13 different databases and 4 other massive lists to give you an amazing amount of information about a collection of spectacular species. So future steps to add on to this, we're really looking at ways to be planting for today, but also to be planting in a way that's going to still be supported by the future climate. So having an overlay of some work that's been done at the University of Hawaii, analyzing future microclimatic shifts and rainfall patterns as a result of climate change, having an additional overlay that allows you to see what species will do well in the current precipitation regime and what species are likely to do well in the future precipitation regimes. And then also possible added analysis of the species that are delivered, so looking at this spatial niches, the sort of stacking and whatnot. And then, as I mentioned, the wiki database integration, and then looking for ways to integrate this on a physical landscape. So then tying it into how does this work with distributing plants through things like Arbor Day and allowing homeowners and other folks that may not have necessarily even the interest, but to be selecting things that are going to require less irrigation, less fertilization, and piece things together in a way that could ideally also then be supporting ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. So it's a big project, but we do have some interest and some possible funding to help it happen, and either way, I've been tinkering away on it for some time, so we are making progress. If anybody likes making apps and wants to talk about it, that'd be great. I have no experience in it, so whatever you have to share is welcome. That said, in terms of climate change, looking back at the past, climate change in the Pacific is not something particularly new. There was an event known as the AD 1300 event, which was a period of approximately 100 years, wherein there was rapid climate change in the Pacific from about 1250 to 1350 AD. And during that period, there was sea level fall, temperature fall, and a serious increase in precipitation. And this shift over this short period of time significantly disrupted the social aspects of, or many of essentially the food security of the Pacific, and destabilized social settings to the degree that there was resettlement. It stopped in large part, or it seemed to, by some, as having completely led to the stop of transoceanic voyaging and communication between distant archipelagos. And also, in some instances, started up warfare that persisted until Western contact. So that doesn't necessarily bode well when we're considering climate change in the Pacific. But as a result, it's been an amazing opportunity to see, as we're getting better science about what the projected impacts are, we're essentially better able to adapt. And so despite the fact that urban growth continues, we're looking at Honolulu as being sort of the hub of research and of moving things forward and understanding how we can best adapt. Because even though urban growth is continuing in the state, most of the growth is occurring on outer islands. So if we can get ourselves together and make things happen on Oahu, it can ideally then be a pattern that other islands can follow, should they, for some reason, choose to become as developed as we have. So the other, sort of two sides to every coin is that also the urban growth, the physical growth. There's more things growing now than there have been in quite some time, and we want to continue to facilitate that and make that happen. And it really is inspiring, and I'm kept going, and it reinforces what we're doing by getting a chance to work with all of the wonderful students that have come through our courses, and also to get to be here with all these wonderful people that you are. So, thanks.
Thanks a lot to Hunter. And questions?
So I was really fascinated by your your complete diet tree crop design.
Mm-hmm.
And I just had a few questions about that. So you said that people would be very malnourished, but you also said that all the caloric needs would be met. So if you could explain that. And then the other question is if seasonality was taken into account in terms of if somebody's caloric needs could be met throughout all 12 months of the year.
I did try and take I've produced papers on a bunch of the different things that were included in here, so if you really want to get into it, I'm more than happy to share those. In terms of analyzing the caloric intake, so just because you get enough calories, I mean, considering sort of the difference between having sufficient calories and being healthy, if we take, say, obesity in the US as a model of that, not always the same thing, right? So the caloric intake in terms of what the suggested daily intake was met, but I don't believe that anyone would probably advise you to have 50% of, or nearly 50% of your diet be fat. So the idea was more to just start working towards an understanding like that, and then it would be providing this baseline that is then designed around. So it's if you consider at least one aspect of the design as being about providing that baseline caloric intake, and having sufficient carbohydrates, then all the other species that you fold in can support your diet diversity. So it was in no way intended to be, let's just eat that. But yeah.
Hello. Hello. I come from Portugal, where we have something very similar with you, which is very good waves. So my question to you is, how do you make it compatible with your great work and surfing? Very simple.
Did my teaching partner put you up to this? So yeah, always happy to get this question. Oh, so you're from Hawaii? Yes. Oh, so you surf? No. Is that what you were getting at? I'm not entirely sure. I mean, there are waves. I think that's probably not the answer you were looking for, but some are in the sea, some are on the mountain. I tend to stay in the mountains. Yeah.
Hi. So I have some family in the North Shore that has a lotus root farm, and I guess they've been dealing with some issues about trying to sell the land to developers just to kind of make a little bit more money, but I was wondering if your
Can you mumble louder?
Sorry. I was wondering if your organization has been able to connect with any pre-existing farmers on Oahu to try and keep family farms going when faced with the decision of selling land to development.
So has our organization been trying to keep farmers farming, I guess is the idea?
Yes.
Yeah. The competition between actively farmed land and development is a very convoluted and one that's been around for quite some time. There has been considerable or large developments that have been proposed recently that are on agricultural land, and there's been a lot of backlash from the community effectively saying we want this to stay in agriculture. It, by and large, is going to be developed. The aspect that is sort of a light at the end of the tunnel is that all of the growth where these developments are occurring are within what's known as the urban growth boundary, and that is essentially the line that was drawn around the city. And all the land that is being developed, unfortunately the farmers generally have binding contracts that don't allow them to actually speak out against the development. So there are some sort of nefarious things going on in terms of the contracting, but a number of the studies that have been done are essentially saying that with the land that we have now, much of which is underutilized, we would still be able to have a sufficient agricultural production on Oahu to provide for ourselves entirely. Whether that makes economic sense is a whole nother question, but there's a lot of, I think, more of a need to get more people farming, and so that's kind of the angle we've been working from.
Hi, I'm next, I think. It was a wonderful talk, and thank you very much. Very exciting work. I just wanted to ask you a quick question. Do you have a problem in urban forests in Hawaii with pests? In Australia, we have a lot of problems with various kinds of pests. You know, like I'm thinking in your case, like rats, birds, fruit fly, anything like that?
We haven't had any large problems like that from my experience. Generally, it's roads and just sort of like soot deposit has been the biggest issues. We're a pretty gentle place. If you can tolerate mosquitoes, you'll be fine. There's really nothing that's going to bite you. So.
Are you familiar with the open space land that they're giving to farmers over on the Big Island? The sugarcane land is being made available to farmers, young farmers at 5 acres for a short, small amount of money. Kelly and Kyle are doing a few acres over there. And there's also hip agriculture. Are you familiar with them?
Yep.
There's some young agroforestry people on the Big Island. So every island has its, its permaculture stuff, and there's some great exciting work going on over there. I go over and get plant material for my greenhouses and stuff. But if you want to get some cheap agricultural land, go to the Big Island and do that.
Yeah, that's true. There is a significant amount of land, and there are a bunch of amazing projects that are going on every island. So this isn't meant in no way to be, all-encompassing. And certainly the best place for cheap land is the Big Island, by far. So.
Hi, I'm wondering, besides the reference to the canoe species, I didn't hear any other reference to the native Hawaiian community, so I'm wondering if you could talk about what, if any, integration they have on the social systems and visible structures piece of your projects, and or, traditional native diet, cultivation, nutritional input, garden, open space design, living design, any of that. And just relationships in general.
Yeah, there's a whole suite of different groups focused on, there has been a growing interest in food security. One of the larger native Hawaiian populations on Oahu is really taken to aquaponics. And so we've integrated with them to some degree and had actually done designs, or had our students do designs for some of their sites, and are slowly, they're getting interested more so in attending PDCs and coming out to permablitzes and hanging out, which has been awesome. In terms of the integration of native species, the idea with the Permaculture books is to facilitate a simpler species selection, and including with that all the canoe species and native Hawaiian species. Generally, a lot of the things that we're planting are canoe species, particularly because they're just so well adapted, and they've been horticulturally selected for so long that you can have vegetative propagation, and it's easy. And so a lot of the designs that are put in heavily rely on canoe species. So.
Yeah, Hawaii's been in the news a lot lately, at least in the New York Times, about their GMO struggles. I wondered, have the permaculture community been involved in that much, or do you know much about it?
I understood you say Hawaii's been in the news, and then...
I'm sorry, GMO.
Yes.
Labeling and GMO, getting rid of GMOs, et cetera.
Yeah, as a concerted effort, it's not something that we've sort of directed our organization towards, but many of the folks that are involved are, we wear multiple hats working with different nonprofits focused on that, or supporting, showing up at protests, putting books out, and making calls and doing the rounds. So it's been interesting. It's been actually a pretty, it seems like there's a sea change occurring in terms of I believe the successful banning of new GMO crops on the Big Island, as well as new stringent regulations that will go into effect for the biotech seed companies on the island of Kauai, which regulate their pesticide use much more stringently and require transparency in terms of the amount that they're using and which chemicals they're using. So there's some really awesome things happening on the political level on that front, and it's a pretty fun time to be around.
Hey Hunter, glad you're here sharing with us. When I was living on the Hawaiian Islands, it was so great to see so many different cultures in the mixing pot there. Can you make some comments about how plant selection or use of plants, kind of the ethnobotany of the islands, what you've learned about that, or what insights you might talk about for a minute?
You mean identifying the culture of a place by looking at what they're growing in their yard? That's a fun pastime. You can pretty much, if your species palette is broad, you can drive around and tell what cultural community neighborhood you're through just based on what's planted in the yard. And so we've, just because of being sort of the melting pot and the gathering place, as a byproduct have exposure and opportunity to interact with spectacular gardeners with amazing plant knowledge, whether it be medicinally, cooking things in ways I've never imagined, or what have you. So it's a rich, very rich space. we're lucky to be a part of. So.
Take our time, slow down and design.